Well, a very good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very warm welcome to this BA Community webinar. I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to be talking about today, both from a professional perspective, but also as a customer of an organization. So as business analysts, of course, we are forever working on specifying products or services which have impact on customers, and we'll be thinking about, what customers' demands are. But we also experience services as customers and know what it feels like when it goes wrong. So I'm really, really pleased that we could be joined today by Michael Lachapelle. I'm sure many of you will know Michael from his presentations, a very, very sought after speaker, consultant in all things innovation and business design related, and of course, sort of a very, very well-known practitioner of the business model canvas, which is a technique that I'm very, very, very fond of, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely my pleasure, Adrian. It was really great to see you again the other day when we first talked about doing this session.
Yeah.
And I'm real happy to be here.
Yeah. It's a shame. It's a shame we can't be speaking in person, but we live in the adaptive world that we live in today. So we're going to be talking about customer motivations, about why customers do what they do. So there may well be some people listening to this. Actually, before we get started, I'm getting ahead of myself. I get excited talking about this topic. So two things I should say for those of you that are listening live. First is, please do type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will cover as many questions as we can before the end of the session. So as your questions appear in your head, do type them in. Also, if you look in the chat window, if you're listening in live, there will be a little link to a jam board. So let me just put this in the chat now. And what that is, if you've not used a jam board before, I'll just show you very, very quickly what it is. So you'll see over here, you've got a Google Jamboard. And it's a bit of an experiment, but what will be really cool is while we're all listening and watching, when Mike says something that particularly resonates with you, you could just go ahead and add a sticky note for that topic. And then at the end, we've sort of got, we've collectively crowdsourced a bit of a record, a bit of a fact sheet for the session. So feel free to just add your notes, add your thoughts. And what I'll do is after the session, I'll change it to read only. And then we've got a bit of a record of the themes that you found particularly interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes, Mike. Always up for an experiment. So.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear how what I say gets interpreted by the people listening.
Yeah. Well, I can see people are literally starting to look at the Jamboard. So that's excellent. Okay, so we're talking about customer motivation, and there may well be people listening into this session thinking, well, I'm a business analyst. What do we mean by customer motivation, and why should it matter to a BA? What's your view on that, Mike?
Well, to really understand the importance of motivations of people and how they affect the marketplace, you really have to go back and think kind of the evolution of our marketplaces. So in the first half of the 20th century, we lived in what was called a supply economy. If you could make something and get it to somebody, you could sell it because there was just so much demand for whatever we made. And you saw the rise of the catalog companies and large department stores, and consumers were just out there to buy. After the Second World War, though, the world kind of changed. Our capacity to manufacture exceeded the demand for people.
Yeah.
And so now suddenly we're producing more than people were asking for. So we entered a new type of economy, which was the demand creation economy. If you will, the golden age of marketing. So if you think of the Rolling Stones song Satisfaction, where Mick Jagger sings about, you can't be as good as man as I am because you don't smoke the same cigarettes that I do.
Yeah.
All these ideas, right? So the marketplace was essentially owned by the producers. It was unidirectional information going out, and the producers controlled the marketplace.
So it's kind of like build it and they will come. That kind of ethos.
Build it and you can convince them to buy it, which was the whole ethos of that period of time. But something happened in the 21st century, which was there was an inversion in the marketplace where the producers were no longer in charge of the marketplace. No longer, unidirectional advertising and the great Mad Men era. And so in the 21st century, there was an inversion where, because of access to information, consumers now control the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So think of it this way. How many times have you watched somebody go into an electronics store and look at what's on, or even a bookstore, and look at what's on the shelf, and then take their phone out immediately to check and see what the price is on Amazon?
We've all done it. Sometimes bookshops seem like convenient places to check stuff out before you buy it online.
That's right. And then you add in all of the mobile and social networking access to information. So, I remember I was working with a company down in Toronto, and I was talking to the salespeople, and I was saying, look, you got to learn that your customers actually knew more about your products than your salespeople do. Because salespeople are given a product sheet, they're given the marketing, whatever they want to say, yet the customers have access to public reviews, to corporate reviews, to their friends' opinions of things, right? To any information about the history of your company, which is even beyond what your product may be. They may hate you because of who you are as a company.
Yeah.
What's happened is you now have this, that's the first change that's happened in the 21st century. Now, the second change in collaboration with that is the disappearance of barriers. Right? So you now have a global competition. You have competitions from outside of industries. This whole argument about the biggest hoteler in the world doesn't own a room.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The largest transportation company in the world doesn't own a vehicle. All right, Uber, Lyft, right? So you've got competition coming in from other industries, right? So you have all of this massive demand for the customer. So in this economy, the only way you're going to really be successful is if you can capture the attention of the customer.
That's really, really interesting, Mike, because as you were saying that, I was thinking about attention. And attention is kind of a rare commodity these days, isn't it? Because I was just thinking about my day today, and I kind of had probably many of us have had one of those days today, where you've got emails coming in, you've got WhatsApp messages, you've got text messages, you've got marketing messages, you've got so actually, like, to cut through that noise, you've got to for me, if I think about hearing an ad or whatever, for me to pay attention, it's got to be quite specific. It can't just be general anymore.
Yeah. Now, absolutely. And apropos to that is, how do you get somebody's attention? How do you capture them? You do that by understanding what motivates them. Right. And so what we need to do in this attention-based economy is understand that people don't purchase things or rent things because of who they are.
Okay.
They do it because they have something they've got to do, or they've got a problem they have to solve. So if you can understand the nature of what it is that they have to do or the problem they have, and you can provide a solution for that, now you've got their attention. Now you've got a fit between your product and their aspirations.
So that's
why.
Sorry, carry on, Mike.
I was just going to say, and that's why grabbing at that motivational end of thing is so important.
Yeah, and as you were thinking about that, I was thinking about that with my business analyst hat on and thinking, because often we're involved in defining services, processes, whatever, which need to solve a problem. So here's a curveball for you, Mike, because you said, I can't remember word for word, but you said something like it doesn't matter who the customer is. What really matters is that we know what their problem, the task they're trying to achieve or the problem they're trying to solve. Now, one technique that we probably use quite a lot as BAs is personas. And personas, well, it's interesting. Some personas I see are better than others because some personas are based on absolutely no data and insight. And in my view, unless they're a proper proto-persona, then they're not very useful. They're someone's opinion. But is there still a place for personas in that discussion, would you say?
There is, but not the personas of the 20th century. right?
Okay.
And this is a problem because the technique of persona, for a large part, I was actually looking at one of my clients. They were working with trying to have a better understanding of their customers, and one of the tools they were using was personas. And so they sent me some examples of their personas. And as I'm looking at it, they're talking about how much money did this person earn, what's his marital status, what's their, where do they live, do they own their own home, right? And I'm looking at this and I'm like, these are all characteristics. There's nothing here about motivation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so how do you know how to solve something if all you've got is a description of the person? So personas are good. And there are a large number of personas that have been adapted to start getting at the motivations, right? So what is this person's largest problem in their day? What is this person's outcomes they want to achieve? And those two things right there are the essence, the core of understanding what motivates your customer. What outcomes do they want to achieve? And what are the barriers? What are the pains that are stopping them from getting there? And if you can address those two, so, we have this tool, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little further, which is the job to be done is one of the tools that you can use to understand motivations. The job becomes a catalyst for you to understand what the underlying outcomes are and what the overriding pains are that you have to address with your value.
Yeah, definitely. I'm absolutely sure we will come on and talk about that technique, because it's a really, really interesting one. But just before we do, one thing I was thinking as you were talking there is I was thinking about the sort of elements of research with users that I've been involved with. And there's always been there's been a perceived danger, like the saying doing gap, where people will say, yeah, I'd really like that thing. Like if you ask, the old adage is, if you ask someone, what would you like? And they'd say, yeah, I'd like this, this, and this. That's different from saying, oh, I've got one of those in the trunk of my car. Will you buy it? They're like, no. no. Now you want commitment. No, it's different. Like, so how do we bridge that? Like, that
well, there's a great history to that, because it started in 1958. Back in it was in Hawthorne, Illinois. A consultant named Henry Landsberger was hired by Western Electric to run an experiment at their plant, and they were positing that the amount of light that was in their space would affect productivity. So they went in there and they measured everybody and what they were doing, and then they upped the lights, and the productivity improved. And then they lowered the lights, and the productivity improved. And then they returned the lights to the original status, and the productivity improved. And Landsberg eventually came to the recognition that it wasn't the lighting at all. It was the fact that the people were being observed that was affecting their behavior.
Right, yeah.
And this is what's known as the Hawthorne Effect. And now you spin forward a few years, and David Ogilvy of the marketing firm Ogilvy and Mathers, one of the legendary marketing firms in that golden age of marketing, David Ogilvy began to be very concerned about the use of focus groups, because under the Hawthorne Effect, people's behavior is going to change in a focus group because they know they're being observed, and they know that they want to say what you want them to say, or they want to look good in, relative to the other people. And so all of these things led to Ogilvy to his 3 rules, which are: people don't know how they feel, people don't say what they know, and people don't do what they say. And that's the origin of that phrase. Wow. People don't do what they say. And it was very much that, when you go and ask people, they will give you what they think you want to know, or they will give you a commitment based on maybe how they're feeling at that moment. But it's a very risky thing to act on, because it is predictive behavior that people won't do what they said they were going to do. The way you avoid that is by running experiments and by running pilots. So get into the market and test the market in real time. That removes the Hawthorne Effect.
Absolutely. Validated experience, actually seeing what people really do. Just one thing I'd like to bring in here, Mike, because I've been on my other screen, I've been looking at the Jamboard, and there are a lot of sticky notes being thrown up. So I'm gonna, and this is always risky to do this live because I can't actually see the text on my other screen. So we're gonna be surprised together and see what this see what's on here. So, okay, there's people. So, people are recording. This is a fantastic one here. Whoever I don't know what anonymous character that is, but they say, really interesting, makes me think about Apple, build it and they will buy it, which used to be true. Consumers always buying the latest model, but that stopped Apple's response. So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole thing about Steve Jobs, isn't there? Steve Jobs is actually saying, or allegedly saying, customers don't know what they want.
Okay, so there's a lot of mythology around Steve Jobs. We accept that as a baseline. There's a lot of mythology. But there is, I mean, the core of what I always found fascinating about Steve Jobs was that he understood he really understood the market. If you go back and you think of Apple at the height of its creativity and its success, it was a three-legged stool. You had Steve Jobs, who understood the market, Johnny Ives, who could create really wonderful products, and then Tim Cook, who could manage a supply chain, which resulted in the success of Apple. You know, for example, at one point, I guess around 2011, 2012, Apple controlled 17% of the phone market, but they made 75% of the profits in the industry.
Wow.
Because their supply chain was so good. But let's jump back to Steve Jobs. And that bit about what people don't know what they want is actually taken out of context. It's one phrase that's been taken out of context. What he was actually overall saying was that your customers only understand the art of what exists. So if you ask your customers what they want, they're going to say faster, better, cheaper. Right? So as an innovator, your job is not to ask them what they want. Your job is to understand what they have to do and where their problems are, and then use your creativity to produce a solution to those outcomes and pains that they never would have thought of themselves.
Yeah.
He was famous for just walking down the street and stopping people on the street to ask them about their phones, regardless of what phone they had. And he would ask them, you know, what do you like to do with this phone? What frustrates you about this phone? Right? Things like that. And I mean, something like the iPad, right? Nobody asked for an iPad. But Steve Jobs understood that people, as we were becoming more information-based, people were reading books online, surfing the internet, dealing with their emails, watching movies, playing games, right? And they needed a different piece of technology for each one of those things. And so Jobs said, okay, so how do we help somebody to do all of those things in a single piece of technology?
Yeah.
And that was the birth of the iPad.
And the convergence. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Again, because I'm thinking with my business analyst hat on, and there is that danger, you know, even if it was like a supposedly small scale project where you just go and ask users what they want, and they'll give you they'll do it based on today's paradigm. It's like, okay, well, we've got a legacy system that we're replacing today, for example. Well, if you just scrape all of the requirements from that legacy system and build them in a new code base, you've just got like an up-to-date version of a legacy system. You've missed the opportunity to take the essence of that. You know, it's like, and I do see that.
And no recognition that outcomes have changed since the first system was put in place.
And all the business rules that are built in there are now wrong because they've never been updated and those kind of things. And you miss the opportunity to innovate and say, what do we no longer need to do? And I see this with some digital transformation programs where it's kind of like, well, let's take the metaphor of the current processes and digitize it. So, you know, so whereas, you know, rather than saying, how can we digitize and scan the form? It's like, well, how can we do this different? How can we, if we look at that as an information flow problem, how can we do it differently? Or how can we preempt the information so we don't need to ask the customer? Or how can we, you know, whatever type of thing.
Yeah, well, and it's really, you know, here's an example of that. Working on a project that the core of it was a reporting issue. We needed to think about how the reporting was being done. And, you know, prior to my involvement, they were using very traditional requirements gathering tools. And I said, well, hang on a second now. Let's pull the people in and ask them, what do you have to tell your boss?
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
What do you have to tell your boss at the end of the day? And then the second question is, what information do you need to know in order to tell your boss that? And then obviously the next follow-on question is, what pieces of data do we have to collect in order to provide that information so that person can tell their boss what they need to tell them?
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
so inverting that process, right? And this also happens with requirements. I mean, if you invert the process of requirements, start with the outcomes that have to be achieved, think about the capabilities necessary to achieve those outcomes, then think about the features necessary to have those capabilities, then write your requirements.
That's such an important aspect, that outcome based. I think so often in projects end up getting tied up in the artifacts. Like, requirements are really
Mhm.
just a means to an end. They're a means of implementing a capability which creates an outcome.
Yeah.
And so good. Well, let's bring in a question now. So Nefra asks, and referring to the Hawthorne effect, I think, is it just that people feel watched, or is it also that the brain wakes up when there's a change? That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to
Wow, it's a complex dynamic that goes on.
that.
I think part of it is that yeah, maybe they become aspirational, and they say, oh, I really like to have this, not thinking through the fact whether or not they want to have it or not, or what the cost would be of it. But often I think it's just that the behavior naturally changes when you're put into a situation where you know you're being watched.
Yeah,
Then you suddenly want to please people. It's natural that you want to please people, or in some cases you want to do the opposite to that. You want to lambaste them for something that they've done in the past, and so whatever the dynamic is, in the end, the outcome is that people are not really telling you information that's going to be reliable. It's the reliability of the information that's the issue, right?
yeah,
So um, it, their behavior is not the issue, it's the reliability of what they tell you. And if it's just told to you, it's a lot less reliable than if you actually have them do it in a practice session, right?
yeah,
So, right. And so if you think about it, having a survey versus interviewing somebody, okay, there's a higher reliability of an interview because you're not only getting at the why, but you have the person sitting in front of you. But even that is lower reliability than having them actually take an action,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
even higher than that, actually make a commitment by purchasing something at the early
Yeah,
stage.
I'm seeing like a pyramid, like a hierarchy of and the higher up that pyramid you get, the more validated learning you get, or the more authentic that validated learning is.
Absolutely. The
That,
more reliable it is.
yeah, yeah,
It's the
definitely.
reliability that you're really concerned with.
Fantastic. So we'll take another couple of questions before we move on to the next topic. So John asks. John says that the point raised was where a product sponsor set a goal of we want something new and innovative, but then at every turn refused to change the established business process to achieve it. Oh wow, we've all been there.
Yes.
I can't change that now, but what sort of things would you have done to get them back to their original goal? Well, Mike, if you can solve that one, you're a millionaire. But I'm really curious as to what your answer would be.
I mean, I have faced it a number of times. And back years ago when I was the senior BA in a center of expertise for business analysis, what we agreed on was when a project came down or when an initiative came down that we had to work on, the first thing was I would be sent in to talk to the sponsor.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it would be on the pretext of trying to scope out the project so we know how much we have to commit to this. And so but ostensibly I would be in there and start the conversation with trying to draw out the outcomes that this person wants. Ultimately, what are the outcomes that you want to have when this is all over? And even before that, the first thing I want to get from them is a clear statement of the problem
Mm-hmm.
that they're trying to address. So let's get the problem defined that we need to address. What do you want to see as an outcome when it's all over? And so we do everything we can to avoid talking about their solution. We talk about things like, what do you think is going to affect the solution? What things do we have to keep in mind? And then the further question is, have you seen anything that's a solution that might work here? Give them a chance to express that they've seen stuff that they might be interested in, because you're going to go back and match those up. But it really comes down to that whole process of understanding the problem, getting the outcomes, looking at the influences.
Yeah.
And from there, then you can scope out a project properly, and you can feed back to the person what they told you they want as outcomes. And that becomes a baseline that you can test against.
Yeah, yeah, and as you were talking there, Mike, I was thinking there's that element of almost co-creation, isn't there? It's the fact that actually we're working with them, we're iterating in the problem space, we're then starting to get towards the solution space. We think this might be a solution, but then we need to discover a bit more about the problem, and so we discover a bit more about the problem, and then we find, well, that solution's not going to work. So we,
Yeah.
you know, and then you got that validated learning pyramid again. So,
Well, I mean, any of these projects will go through 3 stages, right? Discovery, designing option, and then delivering, and they're all iterative. You'll go back and forth as you learn stuff.
yeah.
The problem, I think, with a lot of projects is there isn't sufficient work done at the discovery stage.
Oh,
Right?
you know, I see that so often, and I often talk about. I mean, there are different terms for things, but one of the things I sometimes talk about is pre-project problem analysis. So actually, but like don't start a project if like you don't even know if you've got a project until you've done some problem analysis, because you might, like, you know, I've done analysis where we've actually established there's nothing wrong. Like it's not, there's nothing wrong that a problem can solve. It's a training issue, or, you know, or something else type of thing. So I just want to bring in one other question here before we move topics, and it's asked anonymously. And by the way, if you're attending live, and it's absolutely fine to ask questions anonymously if you would like. So the question is, hi Adrian, great topic tonight. I was wondering about combining this with a topic we discussed a few weeks ago, diversity. Any ideas on techniques or approaches to ensure that you look at all types of customers and not just the ones familiar to you? That's a really interesting question. Any thoughts on that, Mike?
That comes into the time you spend working on your customer segmentation. Right? And so we go back to understanding the concept of their motivations and their outcomes and their barriers. And when you do segmentation, right, rather than segmenting on characteristics, if you segment on the types of jobs, it helps you to really define the work and how it goes. And so, you know, I take when I'm working with a client that is unclear on their customer segmentation, or they're kind of exploring it, we do this little exercise that we run with, where we create a 3-column table. And in the first column, we take somewhere between 5 and 10 specific examples of people that we know would be good our customers or potential customers. In the second column, we ask ourselves, what is it that they have to do, or what is the problem that they have that we can help them with?
Yes.
All right. And we do that for each one of the customers. And then in the third column, we write down, okay, what do they need from us in order to get that task done or to get that problem solved? Now, when you've done this and you start looking down the column 2 or column 3, in column 2, you look down and you begin to see the patterns, the commonalities. That's your segmentation. So if somebody needs better security, if someone needs more time to completion, or like a quicker time to completion, these are, you know, segments of jobs that have to be done. And then the value, if you look down the third column, what they need from you is probably the first statements of what your value proposition should be, what you should be doing to help them. And then you start once you've kind of validated that these are actually the segments that you're going after, that expands. And you start to bring in, as your view expands into their experience rather than who they are and their characteristics, then that allows you to raise up all different types of issues and problems that segments might have that you would never catch if you were just saying, oh, we want to go after small businesses.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. This is making me think, Mike, of I spent a chunk of my career working in insurance, and one of the things I learned to ask a lot is, whenever anyone said customer, is to say, what do you mean by customer?
Yes.
Because you know, because it's like, do you mean the policyholder who bought the policy? Do you mean people who might be insured on the policy who didn't pay for it? Do you mean the insurance broker who sold the policy? Do you mean the third party who's had a collision with our insured who's claiming against our insured? Or do you mean any number of other people? And the mechanism you're describing there, I could imagine, even if we took one like broker or intermediary, well, there are so many different, there's like, your very small broker, there's your regional, but that mechanism would tease out all of those differences because they've got different perspectives on the job.
Well, it also might, because when you start breaking them down by the characteristics, you might be creating false segments.
Yeah.
So the small broker and the medium-sized broker may have 80% of the same jobs.
Exactly.
Right. And so, great. So we can develop a solution that does that. And then there might be 20% of jobs, again, using the old 80-20 perspective here, there might be 20% of jobs that are unique to each of those. And then you need to have value propositions specific for those. But if you start thinking about, like when we talked about when I was the president of the local chapter here, the local IIB chapter in Ottawa, and when we first did our business model for our chapter, one of the things we started talking about was, okay, so, right, one of our customers is the BAs. Okay, so people doing business analysis. Okay, now let's break that down.
Yeah.
Right. So we have certified BAs who have a whole series of issues around their recertification and the level of conversations that they want to have because it's highly advanced. And then you have people who do business analysis with the title of BAs. But there's lots of people out there that do business analysis that don't have the title. And then there's people who are associated with that. And so we actually have 4 customer segments under that, subsegments under that title BA. And we need to make sure that we're helping each of these people in what they do.
Absolutely. And that probably neatly moves us on to a topic that you've mentioned a few times, which is jobs to be done. And so there may well be people who are tuning in or watching the recording who have kind of heard that title, but don't really know what it is. What is jobs to be done in a nutshell, Mike?
So the jobs to be done in terms of a business sense originated at Harvard Business School with Theodore Levitt. And this was the classic Hilti study where the results of the Hilti study essentially stated that people don't buy a hand drill. Hilti is a construction tools manufacturer.
Okay.
Like, people don't buy a hand drill because they want to own a hand drill. Like, very few people ever buy a hand drill, put it in a frame, and put it on a wall. You buy a hand drill because you've got a job to do, and that job is to drill holes. And so if you understand that the motivation of this person is they have to drill holes, and that becomes your point of reference, you very quickly understand, well, we've got 2 kinds of people who drill holes. We have home renovators and we have construction workers. Mm-hmm. And those 2 people have very, very different requirements for the tool they work with. Those construction workers, they drop their tools constantly. They treat them really badly. They use them heavily every day, right? And so you have to design differently for each of those people. Mm. But then there's another customer because, by the way, construction workers don't buy the tools.
Okay.
It's the construction company that buys the tool. Now, what job does the construction company have? Well, they've got to get this construction job done on time and under budget. They can't afford to have breakdowns and downtime because the tools aren't working. So Hilti began to say, okay, well, for these guys, we'll build these kinds of tools, but for this third customer, we're going to create a service for them. Rather than selling them a tool, we're going to sell them a service. Right? And this is Alexander Osterwalder goes into a much deeper analysis of this, but that's the gist of the origin of the job to be done. So the job to be done is a task that somebody has to do, and or a problem that they have to solve.
Yeah.
And that's the catalyst for understanding their motivations.
So how would we, as analysts, how would we elicit and list jobs to be done? So like if I think about a user story, I mean, there are many ways of writing user stories, but there are a few standard kind of templates which we might start with. Is there anything similar for jobs to be done, or is it more free format, more fluid?
No, there's a number of tools. You have Dave Gray, who was very early in the discussion about understanding customers. He had a thing called the empathy map.
Yes.
Which you're looking at all of the things that motivate a person, what they see, what they hear, what they say they want, and all this. Then you have strategizer's value proposition canvas, where you're looking at a customer, it's two components to it. There's the profile of the customer, which is what you understand about your customer. So the job they have to do, or problem, the outcomes they want to achieve, which they call gains, and the barriers, which are called pains. And then on the other side, you've got your actual design process. So how are we going to design our products and services to get fit to this customer? But you have personas that you can use, as long as the personas are focused on looking at what's motivating people, what outcomes do they want, what things are bad in their life, their pains that they need to get over. You also have things like the lean startup canvas, which looks at the product rather than the business. And it helps you to analyze what motivates people, what the problems people have, and what's your solution for those problems. So there's lots of tools out there. One thing that gets confusing, though, and I do need to speak to this because I tend to talk to this every time I teach the subject, is that the job to be done thing has kind of gotten fractured.
Yes.
So, right. So if you want to go the full history of it, this actually began in the 60s and 70s in design schools. And the design people used the job to be done as understanding people are in one state and they want to move to a second state, and the job is the catalyst for that transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got Harvard Business School, Levitt, who came out with this idea in business terms, what a job to be done is. But after that, you have kind of a split. And this gets confusing for some people when they go out and they see Tony Ulwick talking about jobs to be done. And then they see Clayton Christensen and Alexander Osterwalder talking about jobs to be done. And the difference between them is Tony Ulwick treats the job to be done as essentially process optimization. So you identify this job and you break it down into 8 steps. And then you analyze each of the steps and you try to optimize. That's where you find your source of innovation, is by optimizing those steps. And so for all intents and purposes, it's process optimization.
So it's incremental type improvement.
Yeah. And then you've got the likes of Christensen and Osterwalder, who look at the job to be done as understanding what motivates people. And so you're not looking at the process of them using it. You're looking at what's the internal motivation from this person. The job is a catalyst to understand what outcomes do they want to achieve, and why is it hard for them to achieve that? What barriers are in the way? And then when you design, you don't design to the job. You design to the pains and the gains.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because that pains, gains, outcomes. I remember reading something and I can't remember unfortunately which book I read it in, but it's apparently a common question that venture capitalists ask when seeking funding is are you designing a painkiller or a vitamin?
Nice.
Right. And apparently the answer they're looking for most of the time is a painkiller, because there's a stronger motivation to solve a problem than to take your vitamins to stay healthier. And it's kind of interesting.
Those problems are more visceral.
Yeah, right. Because they're painful. So I mean, I really like that sort of pains and gains and that Osterwalder type.
Yeah. And I'm very much on the side of Christensen and Osterwalder. I mean, when I use this and when I teach it, I'm very much along the lines of looking at like what's motivating somebody, rather than looking at the process whereby they do something. There's an interesting question on the board here about customer journeys.
So I see, right? Jason.
Yeah. So I use customer journeys myself sometimes when I'm exploring for identifying the jobs that people have to do. So we map out the customer journey and we use the steps of the journey to identify, okay, so what jobs does the person have to do here? What job does the person have to do here? And then as you start to look at these things, you begin to see, you look at the pains and the gains for each of these jobs. And as you collate them, you begin to get a collated version of all these pains and gains, which gives you a much better picture of this person. You can also then prioritize them based on how important they are to the person.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting, because when you've got that prioritization, I'm thinking about then actually initiating change off the back of that. Once you've got those priorities, then you can start to package those up into a story map or a
Yeah.
backlog or whatever tool you happen to be using.
And it's very important that you do take that step to prioritize, okay?
Mm.
Because when you look at your jobs, you're going to prioritize the ones that have the most potential for you to come up with a lucrative solution for. But when it comes to the pains and the gains, the one thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you're capturing everything, but recognize that you're not going to be able to solve every pain or every gain that this person wants.
Yeah.
And so it's important for you to prioritize them so you know that you're going after those things that are critical to accomplish or crucial to take off the table. So if you spend your time creating nice to haves or annoyances, taking annoyances off, you're much less likely to be successful than if you're going after criticals and crucials. The
Yeah.
other thing that's very important to do is when you do your customer profiling is to do it in absentia of the solution. Because
Yes.
once you look at a customer through the filter of your solution, now you're biasing what you see in that customer, and you've created a high risk of a false positive.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, I'll tell you what, Mike. Let's see what's happening on the Jamboard just before we move on to the next section. So let me just share my screen, and because I've seen lots of sticky notes flying about in my monitor. So let's see what themes people are picking up on. So we've got so attention is a rare commodity. Jobs to be done. Getting customers' attention. People only understand what already exists. A lot of jobs to be done, creating a lot of attentions. Customers hire your product to accomplish their jobs to be done. That's a really interesting aspect. That's a really nice outcome as well. Personas useful, but not the 20th century view. So there's a lot of ideas being thrown up on the board here, Mike, which is always really pleasing
Great.
to see. So
I'm impressed.
yeah, me too. So good. Okay, so what will be useful now is to understand a bit about real world application. So I was wondering
Sure.
if you're able to share one or two examples of where you've been able to use these techniques.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess a really interesting one was I was working with an organization that created a design team, so a design consortium of its customers, and it was a very interesting approach to things. And we were trying to bring innovation into this particular industry. And they had been working on it for about 2 years when they asked me to come in and help them because they were spinning their tires. And so, one of the things we had to go and do was to go back and really define the problem, because they didn't have a good statement on what the problem was and what their design brief was for the solutions. And we clarified that. And it had to do with the younger age groups were a problem for them for long-term sales. And so they started when they were looking at their customers, they used the standard age brackets that are used in most marketing issues, 18 to 21, 21 to 25, 25 to 35, 35 to 45. So they had broken it down by ages.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I made them do was to spend some time in discovery. So everybody that was on the design team had to go out and watch customers purchasing. They had to do 10 hours of watching customers purchasing stuff. And then they had to do 10 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the people came back with this wonderful revelation that what was motivating the people had nothing to do with their age bracket, but was more involved in what stage of life they were in.
Okay.
Right. So that you had people who were just getting out of university and maybe getting their first jobs, right, but still didn't have a lot of money in their pockets. And then you had people who had established careers, maybe, serious relationships, and they're starting to, they start to have money that they can invest in things they can do with. And then you get into young families where, the things, the concerns are around education and saving money, and having costs like healthcare and all of this stuff that they have to consider with children. And so it made us stop and think about our customer segmentation. So we went back, we resegmented our customers based on their stage of life, and we used some research that we did on stages of life. So we resegmented the customers, reprofiled the customers based on what it was. And we had revelations like, for example, if you were thinking about lotteries, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody that's just out of school and doesn't have a lot of money, what they want from a lottery ticket is to win often.
Yep, and lots.
Right? No, they don't care about how much money. They just want to win some money so they have money in their pocket.
Yeah.
The frequency of winning is much more important than the amount that you've won.
Okay, yeah.
And the thing is that they're really interested in social interaction as part of this, right? So leaderboards, cooperative games, things like this.
Yeah.
If you think about somebody that's in an older age bracket with an established family, right now they're more concerned. They're thinking longer term, so they want the big hit, and they're willing to take the lower risk, or the lower frequency of winning, as long as it's got a much better payback. And so as you look at each of these, so when we were looking at each of these stages, we began to analyze what was driving, what was motivating these people. And we were able to restructure the product that was being created for each of the lower segments of adolescent, young, professional, married with a family. And so we resegmented everything based on that. And that allowed us to create prototypes which were designed specifically for each of those segments to try and drive things forward.
It's really interesting. That reminds me of, again, when I was working for an insurance company where the insurance product was the insurance product, but one of the things we were doing at one point was highlighting different features. And it was largely based on people in different life stages. And for example, one thing that I always remember, from what I remember, the market responded really well to, was if you are in an accident and you have a child car seat, the child car seat will be replaced free of charge, right, as part of the claim. Now that is actually, or at the time, was a legal requirement that every insurance policy had to cover. It was an absolute true statement. It would happen, but it would happen with any policy you bought in the UK at the time. But by knowing that it was a priority of a particular market and actually highlighting it was potentially going to improve conversion. So that speaks to the actual, know the real concerns. Because if you've got a kid and a child and a child seat, that's going to be important. You can actually highlight the right aspects of the product or service.
Oh yeah. Another example of that would be after the crash in 2008. A lot of car companies were concerned that people wouldn't have money to buy cars. And so they started slashing prices, big sales, and cutting their profits down, trying to boost their sales, except for one car company, which was Hyundai. And I think it was Hyundai. They went out and they spent time talking to their customers, and they discovered that people still had money. What they were afraid of was their circumstances changing in the near future.
Yeah.
And so Hyundai created this program where if you lost your job or if your financial circumstances changed drastically within the first 2 years of owning the car, they would buy the car back from you.
Fantastic.
Now, at a time when sales were precarious for most car companies, Hyundai sales just soared. And what this promise of, we'll buy the car back from you at full price. And over the 3 years that they ran this, was 5 cars returned.
Wow. So right? So it is. It's about, I guess, sometimes challenging our perception of what the customer's needs are. And really, so I just want to bring in a question here.
Sure.
That Kavita asks, and Kavita asks, what about products for public services? There are layers of users and profitability is not in question. Now I know that and I'm sure Kavita would agree that although profitability isn't in question, of course, value for money and cost savings often are the flip side of that. But what's your view on that, Mike?
Well, I worked in the Canadian federal government for 10 years. I know on this business innovation stuff. And I guess the favorite perspective on that was actually taught to me by John Zachman, who is one of my favorite people in the world.
He's just a legend, John
Yeah,
Zachman.
yeah, and so like one of the early jobs that I did was an architecture job, and so I spent some time on that, but that's how I got to know John. But I remember John explaining to me that the fallacy of thinking that the government is a business, because the government is not a business. There is no business in the world where every certain number of years, the customers can throw out the board of directors. So that's foundationally why government is not a business. Now, government can use business principles, right? But the other thing, and this is the one that I think is pertinent to or relevant to what this person is asking, is that government has a unique situation in that there is a duality of customers. So you have the beneficial customer. So that person for who was going to get benefit of whatever program is being created or whatever work is being done. But in between that person and the organization is a second customer, which is the political customer.
Yes.
The political customer can filter and constrain how the services or the products are delivered to the beneficial customer, which can be enormously frustrating. But if you don't understand that dynamic, you could create a lot of problems for yourself. And so you have to understand that when, as soon as if you say you're using a business model canvas, one of your customer segments might be the local citizens, but a second customer has to be the government, the policy side of the government. And right, you have to strike a balance between these two when you're looking at how it affects the things. And so you need to understand both. And even in private industry, like one of the problems we run into a lot of times is people don't understand that you have to strike a balance between the outcomes for the business and the outcomes for the customers. Right, so you have to do that balance as well. But it's peculiar. It's peculiar in the public sector and government because you have such a strong force. And so when you design, you have to design to ensure that you're meeting both of those customers.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because everything you've just said really resonates with my experience of public sector as well in the UK. But I'd add another thing that I've observed working in public sector or doing projects in a public sector environment is that in the private sector, you can say, oh, this class of customer we don't want to appeal to. So we just won't work in this channel because, and unless there's a legal requirement for us to, for say, accessibility, then of course we will. But we're not going to, if we're an insurance company, we're not going to insure Ferraris because they're too high risk or whatever. But if you're a government, you generally have to deal with unlimited variability because if you're a tax authority, you've got to accept the tax situation of every single citizen in the country. Which means that some of the traditional process improvement approaches, which say focus on the 80%, actually just create lots of exceptions and lots of very expensive exceptions. So it's an interesting dynamic where
you have to, and it gets down to during the discovery phase. When you're actually looking at the early stages of how we're going to deal with this, you have to do stakeholder mapping. It's critical on these projects. And that means understanding, who are the primary customers of this? Who are the end users of this? Who are you giving this to? But then you have the secondary. So you have the primary users of the something, and then you have the secondary, which is people who are contributing to this or taking stuff out of it. And then you also have a tertiary, which are people who will influence how things are done. So these are the rule makers, the policy makers, the trade agreement people, right? So you have to understand where the roles of these different people are inside of the government. That's why stakeholder mapping is really so important.
Yeah.
And in the commercial world, the equivalent of that is understanding when you sell B2B. That you need to understand the hierarchy of customers that are involved in a B2B sale. It's not just one person you're selling to.
Absolutely. And an acronym that I've come to really find useful, and it's not exhaustive, right? But is UCOB, and UCOB stands for user, customer, as in economic customer, the person writing the check, owner, who's the person or department that actually then owns and maintains it, and beneficiary, right?
Yeah.
Those can be the same people or they can be different people. And actually even beneficiary is a bit of an interesting one, because sometimes they can be perceived as a bit of a victim. Like if you get a parking ticket, you're receiving the outcome of that process, but you don't feel like a beneficiary. But then that raises the question of, well, actually, are the beneficiaries the other road users who don't have clogged streets? So you start to get, that drives some really interesting conversations. So Mike, we could continue talking for hours on this. I always enjoy our conversations, but we must start to draw this to a close. So
sure.
So what, if you had like a closing thought or one or two takeaways that you think, BAs, business analysts, change folks that are tuned in or watching the recording, that they should take away, what would those one or two or three things be?
I think the most important things for me is understanding that when it comes to thinking about your customers, it's about understanding their motivations and using those motivations, their outcomes and their pains, as a way to segment your customers so that you can build solutions that will fit what they need, even though they may not be able to express what they need to you. But if you understand what outcomes they're trying to get or what problems they're trying to solve, that helps you to do that. And so that's an economy. And in order to do that, I think one of the key tools that we need to think about is understanding people's jobs, their tasks, whether you subscribe to the whole job to be done theory, that's one thing, and the approaches that are established by that. But even just thinking about the world in terms of what do people want to do, right? And that's the catalyst for understanding what motivates them.
Yeah.
And so, and then understanding in some context, you need to balance the customer's outcomes, the motivations of the customer, with the motivations of the organization.
Yeah.
Whether that's public sector or private sector, you have to keep your mind open to both of those.
Yeah. And just to interject there, we've had a really interesting comment from Tim. Tim says in the Ministry of Defence MOD procurement, they explicitly recognise customer one and customer two, which are the end user and headquarters, so MOD Centre in London, who hold the budget, which is really interesting. That's explicitly codified, but very, very sensible. And I'm sure there are even more customers. That's probably the beginning of the labyrinth of complexity. So, thank you so much, Mike. That's been a fascinating conversation, and I know that people will have got a lot from this, and I am certain people will want to stay in touch with you. So how is the best way for people to connect with you? Are you happy for people to throw the occasional question at you after this session? How can people?
Oh, sure. They can connect with me on LinkedIn. Alternately, they can reach me at michael@businessmodelfulcrum.com, which is the name of my company, Business Model Fulcrum. So they can reach me either one of those ways.
Fantastic. And what I'll do, there'll be an email that goes to everyone that registered after the session. I'll just put those in the email so people can connect with you. And if you're watching live, I'll also put a link to the Jamboard, because I can see even more Post-it notes being thrown on there, but we're out of time, so we can't discuss them. I'm pleased.
Well, it's been my absolute pleasure, Adrian. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. And so the only thing left for me to say is, again, a massive thank you, Michael, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here. A massive thank you to everyone who has tuned in live. And indeed, if you are watching the recording, thank you for watching the recording as well. As a reminder, really the ethos behind these BA community webinars was to, in some ways, discuss things that are perhaps on the periphery of business analysis, stuff that we're not hearing about perhaps as much as we might want to in the BA community. So with that in mind, after you've attended this session, in a few hours, you'll get an email which will have a link to Michael's details. It'll also have a link to a quick survey. There's just 3 questions on that survey. One of the questions is, what topics would you like to hear more about? Please, 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 if you could take 5 minutes to fill it in, I'd really appreciate it. If there are topics you want to hear about, let me know, because I will try and make it happen. I'm trying to do about 1 webinar a week at the moment. And even better, if you've got a topic in mind and you think, I'd quite like to present a webinar on that, then please get in touch and we can absolutely make that happen. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Mike. Have a great evening, morning,
Thank you,
afternoon.
Adrian. Bye from Canada.
Yeah, and bye from the UK, and bye, and see you all again soon.